Imagine a place where you are supposed to be the safest. A place where dedicated professionals work around the clock to protect life. A hospital. Most of us see hospitals as sanctuaries of healing. We trust the doctors. We trust the machines. And most of all, we trust the nurses, the people who sit by the bedside when the rest of the world is asleep. But in the clean, white hallways of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, a shadow was moving. For 16 years, this shadow walked from room to room. He wore a blue uniform. He carried a clipboard. He spoke in a soft, kind voice. To the patients, he was a helper. To his co-workers, he was a quiet, reliable colleague. But behind that calm face was a secret that would eventually lead to one of the biggest investigations in American history. He wasn't using a typical weapon. He didn't leave a messy trail. Instead, he used the very tools meant to save lives. He used small vials and clear liquids. He moved in the silence of the night shift, where the beeping of heart monitors was the only sound. Patients who were expected to recover suddenly took a turn for the worse. It didn't make sense. The doctors were confused. The families were heartbroken. But nobody suspected the quiet man in the blue scrubs. His name was Charles Cullen. For nearly 2 decades, Charles was a ghost in the system. He worked at 9 different hospitals. Every time something strange happened, he simply moved to the next one. He was hiding in plain sight, protected by a system that failed to look closely at the numbers. They called him the Angel of Death, but the reality was much more complicated than a simple nickname. This is not just a story about a man. It is a story about how silence can be deadly. How did one man manage to stay under the radar for so long? How did he bypass the security of major medical institutions? And what was really going on inside the mind of the most prolific serial killer in New Jersey history? The answers are hidden in the files of hospitals that preferred to stay quiet rather than face the truth. But before we can understand the crimes, we have to understand the man. We have to go back to the beginning, to a childhood that was marked by loss and a strange, early obsession with the exit from this world. Charles Cullen was born in 1960 in Newark, New Jersey. From the very start, his life was not easy. He was the youngest of 8 children. His father passed away when Charles was still an infant, leaving the family struggling. Growing up in a crowded house without a father figure left Charles feeling isolated and invisible. Those who knew him back then described him as a miserable child. He didn't have many friends. He didn't play like the other kids. Instead, he spent a lot of time alone, lost in his own thoughts. He once told investigators that his childhood was devoid of any real happiness. But the real turning point came when he was in high school. His mother, the only stable person in his life, died in a sudden car accident. Charles was devastated. But it wasn't just the loss that affected him. It was how the hospital handled it. They didn't notify him immediately, and they cremated her before he could say a final goodbye. This event left a deep scar on his mind. He felt betrayed by the very institutions meant to care for people. After high school, Charles tried to find a sense of belonging. He joined the Navy. He served on a submarine, a place where you are constantly surrounded by people but can still feel completely alone. The pressure of the Navy was too much for him. He struggled with his mental health and eventually received a medical discharge. He was lost. He was drifting. He needed a career where he could have control. He decided to go to nursing school. On the surface, it seemed like a noble choice. He wanted to help people. Or at least, that's what he told everyone. He graduated in 1986 and immediately landed a job at St. Barnabas Medical Center. This was the beginning of a 16-year journey through the medical world. At first, Charles seemed like a great nurse. He worked hard. He took the shifts nobody else wanted. He was the nice guy who was always willing to help out. But underneath that helpful exterior, something was shifting. In 1988, the first unusual incident occurred. A patient passed away under mysterious circumstances. Then another. The hospital began to notice a pattern. They realized that whenever Charles was on duty, the statistics changed. They launched an internal investigation. But instead of calling the police, they did something that would become a tragic theme in this story. They let him go. They didn't give him a bad review. They didn't report him to the nursing board. They simply let him walk out the door and into another hospital. They passed the problem to someone else. And Charles Cullen, now aware that he could move without being caught, began to realize just how much power he had. Throughout the 1990s, Charles Cullen became a professional drifter. He worked at hospital after hospital across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. He worked in the intensive care units, ICU, and cardiac care units. These are the places where patients are at their most vulnerable. His method was simple and incredibly difficult to detect. He would gain access to the hospital's medication supply system. In the 90s, these systems were becoming computerized, but they weren't perfect. Charles figured out how to withdraw medications without leaving a clear trail. He would take drugs that were common in a hospital setting, medications that regulate the heart. In small doses, these drugs are life-saving. In the wrong hands, they become a silent tool for something else. Charles would inject these substances into the 4 bags of patients. He didn't pick people he had a grudge against. He didn't pick people who were suffering greatly. He picked people almost at random. The patients would suddenly experience a code blue, a medical emergency. The staff would rush in to save them, often with Charles helping right alongside them. To everyone else, it looked like a tragic complication of a pre-existing illness. To Charles, it was a secret experiment. But why? When he was later asked about his motive, he claimed he was trying to end their suffering. He called it an act of mercy. But the investigators looked at the files. Many of the victims were not terminal. Some were young. Some were about to go home. The mercy excuse didn't hold up. It was about power. It was about the quiet man finally being the one who decided who stayed and who went. As he moved from Warren Hospital to Liberty Nursing, and then to others, the bodies followed. At Warren Hospital, he was suspected of foul play after several patients died of heart complications. Again, the hospital chose to protect its reputation. They didn't want a scandal. They didn't want lawsuits. So, they gave Charles a neutral reference and allowed him to move on. This is the most frustrating part of the Angel of Death story. Charles Cullen wasn't a genius. He wasn't a master of disguise. He was simply lucky that the system was more afraid of bad publicity than it was of a potential killer in the wards. He lived a double life. At home, he was a father. He was going through a messy divorce. He was struggling with debt. He even spent time in psychiatric facilities because of his own mental health struggles. But every time he got out, he was able to get another nursing job. The background checks were shallow. The hospitals were desperate for staff. The shadow was getting darker. By the time he reached the early 2000s, Charles was no longer just a nurse who made mistakes. He was a man who felt invincible. He had escaped detection at 7 different facilities. He believed no one was looking. But he was about to make a mistake at a place called Somerset Medical Center. In 2002, Charles Cullen started working at Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey. By this point, he was highly experienced. He knew the software. He knew the pharmacy routines. But Somerset was different. They had a new system for tracking medication, and more importantly, they had people who were paying attention. In the summer of 2003, a few pharmacists at Somerset noticed something strange. They were looking at the records of the automated medication dispensing machine. They saw that a nurse named Charles Cullen was withdrawing high amounts of specific heart medications. What was even stranger was that he was withdrawing them for patients who weren't even assigned to him. Then, he would immediately cancel the request in the computer. It looked like a glitch, but the medication was still being taken out. At the same time, patients in those wards were having unexpected heart issues. The pharmacists took their findings to the hospital administration. You would think the police would be called immediately. But again, the silence continued. The hospital spent months doing their own internal review. They hired outside consultants. They looked at the data, all while Charles Cullen continued to work his shifts. It wasn't until a patient named Reverend Florian Gall died unexpectedly that the pressure became too much. Gall was recovering well until he suddenly crashed. The lab results showed an impossibly high level of medication in his system, something that couldn't have happened naturally. Finally, The hospital contacted the New Jersey State Police. 2 detectives, Danny Baldwin and Tim Braun, were assigned to the case. They were not medical experts, but they were experienced investigators. When they started looking into Charles Cullen's past, their jaws dropped. They saw the trail of hospitals. They saw the suspicious deaths that followed him like a cloud. They realized they weren't dealing with a one-time accident. They were looking at a serial killer who had been active for 16 years. But they had a problem. All the evidence was digital or statistical. They didn't have a smoking gun. They didn't have a witness. They needed a confession. And to get it, they needed someone on the inside. They turned to Amy Loughren. Amy was a nurse at Somerset and one of the few people Charles actually considered a friend. She was a single mother with a heart condition, and Charles had often helped her during her shifts. She couldn't believe her kind friend could be a monster. But when the detectives showed her the records, the times Charles accessed the drugs and the times the patients died, she couldn't deny the truth. The data was perfect. It was a map of murder. Amy agreed to help the police. She agreed to wear a wire and talk to Charles. The tension was at an all-time high. A quiet dinner at a local restaurant became a life-or-death operation. Amy sat across from the man she thought she knew, knowing that he was a killer, while the police listened from a van nearby. She confronted him softly. She asked him why he did it. She told him she knew. Charles didn't explode. He didn't get angry. He just sat there, cold and silent. He eventually said, "I want to go down fighting." That night, they didn't get the full confession, but they had enough to bring him in for questioning. Inside the interrogation room, Charles Cullen was a wall of silence. For hours, he sat with his head down. He wouldn't look at the detectives. He wouldn't answer their questions. The investigators were worried. Without a confession, the case might fall apart in court. Then, they brought Amy in again. They let her sit with him. In that small, quiet room, the nice guy finally broke. Not because of the evidence, but because of the one person who had been his friend. He started talking. He didn't just admit to the deaths at Somerset. He started listing the other hospitals. He spoke about patients from 10 years ago as if it were yesterday. He told them he didn't know how many people he had killed. He said it was too many to count. He eventually confessed to around 40 murders. But investigators who spent years looking at his records believe the number is much higher. Some experts estimate that over his 16-year career, Charles Cullen may have been responsible for as many as 400 deaths. If that is true, he is the most prolific serial killer in history. In 2006, Charles Cullen was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms. He will never leave prison. During his sentencing, he remained defiant, even trying to disrupt the proceedings. The quiet nurse was gone, replaced by a man who seemed to enjoy the attention he was finally getting. But the story doesn't end with Charles going to jail. The real impact of this case was the change it brought to the medical world. Because of Charles Cullen, laws were changed. In New Jersey, the Cullen Law was passed, which requires hospitals to report suspicious behavior and healthcare workers' performance to the state. It removed the protection of reputation that allowed Charles to move from job to job. Today, medication systems are much more secure. Background checks are deeper. But the scars remain. The families of the victims still wonder why no one spoke up sooner. They wonder how a man could walk into a room 400 times with a lethal vial and no one stopped him. Charles Cullen wasn't a monster from a movie. He was a man who took advantage of a broken system. He was a man who used our trust as a weapon. He proved that sometimes, the most dangerous people aren't the ones shouting in the streets, but the ones moving quietly in the shadows of the night shift. The Angel of Death title is a lie. There was no mercy in what he did. There was only a cold, calculated desire for control. As we look back at this case, we are reminded that safety is not just about locks and alarms. It's about the courage to speak up when something feels wrong. So, next time you walk through those quiet hospital halls, remember the story of Charles Cullen. Remember that the system is only as good as the people who run it. And remember that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a deadly silence. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into one of the most chilling cases in true crime history. If you found this story insightful, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel.